Listen, I need you to hear this because it might just save you from weeks, months, or years of confusion. If you've ever been with someone who seems distant, hot one minute and cold the next, you're not crazy, you're not too needy, and no, you didn't imagine the connection. But here's the truth. Even if they love you, someone with an avoidant attachment style can and will walk away. Today, we're going to break this down. I'm talking about the real reasons, 7 of them, why an avoidant will discard you even when it's clear they care. This isn't about blame. It's about awareness. Because once you see the pattern, you can stop taking it personally and finally take your power back. Let's get into it. When someone has an avoidant attachment style, emotional intimacy feels dangerous. It's not that they don't want love, they do, but the experience of being emotionally close to someone feels threatening, even if they can't always explain why. They may crave connection on a deep level, but when they actually get it, their internal alarm system goes off. The closer you get, the more exposed they feel, and that exposure taps into deep-seated fears, often formed in childhood, of being smothered, judged, or losing themselves in the relationship. Avoidants typically grow up in environments where emotional needs weren't consistently met or where independence was overly emphasized. As a result, they learn to rely on themselves and suppress their emotions to stay safe. Vulnerability, which is the key to deep connection, was either discouraged or never modeled. So now, as adults, when someone tries to get close and love them in a healthy way, they interpret that closeness as a threat. The very thing that feels good to a securely attached person, emotional availability, openness, intimacy, feels overwhelming and suffocating to an avoidant. This doesn't mean they don't love you. It means that their nervous system is reacting to closeness as if it's danger. That's why they can be affectionate and connected one day, then cold or distant the next. When they feel you pulling in emotionally, they may unconsciously push you away. It's not about what you did wrong. It's about how their brain is wired to protect them from feelings they've learned are unsafe. Often, when the relationship starts out, an avoidant partner seems open, fun, maybe even charming and interested. In the early stages, there's space and mystery, and that works perfectly for them. But as soon as things start to deepen, when expectations of emotional presence, commitment, or vulnerability increase, they start to feel uncomfortable. They may not even realize why they're withdrawing, but inside they're experiencing a rising level of stress that they associate with losing their freedom or being engulfed. That's why emotional intimacy becomes the trigger point. They may begin to pick fights over small things. They might accuse you of being too needy or emotional. They may start to focus on your flaws as a way to create distance and justify pulling back. The reality is, none of this is truly about you. It's about what your closeness represents, a potential loss of self, a return to emotional discomfort, or a feeling of being trapped in something they can't control. And this is the heartbreaking part, because when you love someone who's avoidant, you likely want to get closer to help them feel safe, to reassure them that you're not going to hurt them. But the more you try to close the gap, the more they feel the need to create distance. It becomes a painful cycle. One person reaches in, the other pulls away, not because they don't care, but because caring too much feels risky to them. That risk isn't always conscious, but it's real in how it affects their behavior. Sometimes the avoidant person will even tell themselves that you're not the one simply because you're getting too close. Their brain tries to make logical sense of their emotional discomfort by telling a story that creates justification for leaving. Maybe you're too intense, too emotional, or not the right fit. But often what they're really trying to do is escape the discomfort of being emotionally seen. That's why emotional intimacy is one of the biggest reasons an avoidant will discard someone even if they love them. It's not about the absence of love. It's about the presence of fear. Love requires openness. Intimacy requires being known. And for someone who spent their life associating closeness with danger, the idea of being fully known can feel unbearable. So they run. They shut down. They pull away. It's not your fault. It's not because you weren't enough. It's because their capacity to tolerate emotional closeness has limits that even they may not understand. And until they're willing to recognize those patterns and do the work to heal, they'll continue to sabotage the very thing they want most: love that's deep, connected, and safe. Avoidants often struggle with the concept of control, especially in intimate relationships. To them, control equals safety. It's how they manage their emotions, their environment, and most importantly, their vulnerability. Losing control feels like stepping into chaos, and emotional chaos is exactly what they've spent much of their life trying to avoid. This need for control doesn't always look aggressive or obvious. Sometimes it's subtle. They keep their schedule tightly packed, compartmentalize their life, avoid deep conversations, or maintain emotional distance so no one ever gets too close. But make no mistake, this behavior is rooted in fear. When they sense that the relationship is asking for more than they feel ready to give, they may start pulling away, not because they don't care, but because they're terrified of losing control over their inner world. Control helps them maintain a sense of autonomy and manage the anxiety that comes with emotional closeness. When you're in a relationship with an avoidant and you begin to rely on them, ask for consistency, or expect a certain level of emotional presence, they may perceive this as a threat to their independence. Even healthy relationship needs can feel overwhelming to someone who equates closeness with being consumed or losing themselves. They often believe that to be close to someone means to give up parts of themselves, and that belief makes them resistant, guarded, and often reactive. This fear of losing control can surface in small ways at first. They may resist making plans too far ahead, shy away from labeling the relationship, or get uncomfortable when you talk about the future. These aren't just signs of indecision, they're protective behaviors. Deep down, they're trying to prevent the relationship from evolving into something they can't manage or predict. Because unpredictability means potential emotional risk, and emotional risk is exactly what they're wired to avoid. As the relationship progresses and your emotional bond deepens, an avoidant may feel they're no longer in charge of the pace. Your desire for closeness may feel like pressure to them, even if it's expressed in healthy and loving ways. You might think you're building something meaningful while they feel like they're losing grip on their emotional boundary. And when that feeling intensifies, they often respond by withdrawing, shutting down, or even ending the relationship entirely. It's not necessarily because they don't love you, it's because love, when it asks them to open up and let go of control, becomes a battlefield of conflicting needs. To avoidance, love can feel like a trap, not because the person they love is doing anything wrong, but because the emotional demands of intimacy threaten their internal balance. They may tell themselves, this is moving too fast, or I just need space, or I don't think I'm ready for this. But those phrases are often code for, I feel like I'm losing control and I don't know how to stay in this without losing myself. So rather than risk that emotional unraveling, they'll cut the relationship off or sabotage it until it falls apart just to regain a sense of power over their own emotions. And here's where the discard comes in. When they feel backed into a corner emotionally, when they can't create enough space to regulate themselves, they'll often choose to leave. It's not a calm, rational choice. It's an act of emotional self-preservation. They're trying to regain control, even if that means letting go of someone they love. They might seem cold or detached in that moment, but what you're seeing is the armor they've learned to wear their entire life. It protects them from the fear of being overwhelmed by someone else's emotional needs, or worse, their own. To the person on the receiving end, this can be incredibly painful and confusing. One minute everything feels intimate and connected, and the next the avoidant is distant, disinterested, or gone altogether. You're left wondering what changed, what you did wrong, and how someone who claimed to care could walk away so easily. But the truth is, it wasn't easy for them. It was just necessary for their sense of emotional control. Avoidants are not bad people. They're often deeply sensitive, intelligent, and capable of love. But their need for control is rooted in past experiences where vulnerability led to pain, rejection. Until they confront those patterns and learn how to regulate intimacy instead of fear it, They'll continue to equate closeness with chaos, and control will always come first, even over love. When you open up emotionally to an avoidant partner, something unexpected often happens. Instead of feeling closer or more connected, they may start to pull away. This isn't because you're doing something wrong by being vulnerable. It's because your vulnerability triggers their internal discomfort. To someone with an avoidant attachment style, emotional vulnerability can feel overwhelming, even threatening. It challenges the emotional distance they've worked so hard to maintain, and it confronts them with feelings they often don't know how to process or respond to. Avoidants typically grew up in environments where emotional expression wasn't safe, welcomed, or understood. They may have been taught directly or indirectly that showing feelings leads to rejection, punishment, or being a burden. So as adults, when someone they care about begins to open up emotionally, especially in a way that's raw, authentic, or deeply personal, they may not know how to hold space for it. It's not because they don't want to, but because they've never learned. Vulnerability to them doesn't feel like an invitation to connect. It feels like pressure, responsibility, or exposure. When you're vulnerable with an avoidant partner, when you express sadness, fear, anxiety, or even deep love, it often stirs up unresolved emotions in them. These emotions may have been buried for years. Your openness forces them to confront their own buried pain or unmet needs, and that can feel incredibly destabilizing. Rather than staying present with your emotions, they'll instinctively shut down, retreat, or deflect. They might change the subject, dismiss your feelings, go silent, or become visibly uncomfortable. In some cases, they may even lash out or criticize, not because they're angry with you, but because your vulnerability has made them feel emotionally unsafe. This is confusing for the partner who's trying to build intimacy. You're doing what healthy relationships require, being honest, expressing feelings, seeking connection, but with an avoidant, those efforts often lead to emotional withdrawal. It can feel like every time you open your heart, they take a step back. You start to doubt yourself. You might even start hiding your feelings, thinking that's the only way to keep the peace. This dynamic becomes a trap where the more emotionally available you are, the more distant they become. One of the key reasons avoidants struggle with your vulnerability is because it invites a level of emotional accountability they're not comfortable with. When you share something personal, especially something that shows your emotional needs or pain, they may feel an unspoken pressure to respond in a way they're not equipped for. To them, being emotionally responsible for someone else feels suffocating. They interpret it as a demand, even if that's not your intention. The result? They back away to regain emotional distance, which to them feels like relief. Over time, this creates a painful cycle. You reach out for closeness. They withdraw. You feel abandoned, they feel overwhelmed. Eventually, they may start to resent the emotional depth of the relationship, not because they don't care, but because they don't know how to be in that emotional space without feeling engulfed. That's when they start questioning the relationship, looking for reasons why it's not working, or imagining that someone less emotional would be a better fit. In truth, it's not about you at all. It's about their own emotional limitations. For someone with an avoidant attachment style, the intensity of another person's vulnerability can feel like drowning. They don't have the internal tools to swim in that emotional depth, so they try to get back to shallow water where they feel safer, even if it means disconnecting. In some cases, they'll even leave the relationship entirely, not because they don't feel love, but because they can't handle what that love demands from them emotionally. They don't want to hurt you, but your openness reminds them of everything they've spent their life avoiding: emotional exposure, dependence, and the fear of being needed in ways they can't fulfill. Unless they recognize this pattern and begin doing the work to understand and heal their discomfort with vulnerability, they'll continue to see emotional openness not as a gift, but as a threat. And that's why, even in the presence of real love, they may still discard someone who simply wanted to be seen. One of the most painful and confusing dynamics in a relationship with an avoidant partner is the shift from being idealized to suddenly being seen as a disappointment. At the beginning, the avoidant often places you on a pedestal. You may feel like you're finally being seen, like someone truly appreciates and values you in a way that feels different, even special. And in many ways, they do at first. But this intense idealization isn't necessarily about who you are. It's about what you represent to them, the hope of a perfect connection that doesn't threaten their emotional defenses. Avoidant individuals tend to struggle with seeing others in nuanced, realistic ways when it comes to emotional closeness. They often split people into categories: safe or unsafe, good or bad, perfect or flawed. In the early stages, they idealize you because you're emotionally distant enough, mysterious enough, or new enough to not activate their deep-seated fears of vulnerability and engulfment. As long as you stay within that fantasy space, they feel secure. The relationship feels exciting, but not yet threatening. But idealization is inherently unsustainable. As the relationship progresses and you begin to reveal your real self, your needs, your fears, your imperfections, the pedestal starts to crack. For most people, this is a natural and healthy phase of deepening connection. It's when the ideal gives way to something more real, more grounded. But for the avoidant, this transition feels like a loss. The illusion of the perfect, safe partner begins to fade. And with it comes a sense of disappointment or even betrayal, despite the fact that nothing wrong has happened. This shift happens because what they were in love with wasn't fully you. It was the idea of you. And once reality sets in, once you start to expect emotional presence or express your own needs, their fear system kicks in. They begin to perceive you differently, not through a lens of connection, but through a lens of self-protection. Your normal human behavior, seeking reassurance, asking for deeper connection, sharing your vulnerability, are reinterpreted as signs that you're too much, too needy, or not who they thought you were. This is why you may feel like the relationship flips suddenly. One week, you're the best thing that's ever happened to them, and the next they seem irritated by everything you do. It's not always conscious, but this devaluation is a defense mechanism. By focusing on your flaws or exaggerating your emotional needs, they create distance. It's easier for them to push you away if they convince themselves that you've changed or that you're no longer what they want. In reality, you haven't changed. They've simply moved past the idealization phase and are now reacting to the emotional weight of real intimacy. What's especially painful is how quickly this can happen. You might share something vulnerable or ask for more closeness, and suddenly they seem distant, disinterested, or critical. You're left wondering what you did wrong when all you did was show up authentically. But to them, that authenticity feels like a burden because it disrupts the fantasy they were clinging to, a fantasy where love didn't require emotional responsibility. Sometimes they'll stay in the relationship even after this mental shift, but their behavior changes. They may become less affectionate, less engaged, more critical. You start to feel like you're chasing the person they used to be, trying to get back to the version of the relationship where you were idealized. Other times they'll end things altogether, claiming something vague like the spark is gone or we're just not compatible. But underneath those statements is a fear that true intimacy will expose their own emotional inadequacy. And it's safer to leave than to risk being seen or having to truly see someone else. This cycle of idealization and devaluation is not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of their internal struggle. They crave love, but only when it stays within their comfort zone. When love starts to feel real, when it starts to ask for presence, consistency, and depth, they often retreat. They may not realize they're doing it, but in their mind, the safest way to regain control is to convince themselves that you're no longer right for them. It's heartbreaking because you were never asking for too much. You were asking for connection. But in the world of someone with avoidant attachment, that connection, once it becomes real, feels like too much to bear. And so rather than risk the discomfort of emotional closeness, they discard the person they once idealized, not because they stopped caring, but because they never fully learned how to love in a way that includes both fantasy and reality. To someone with an avoidant attachment style, independence isn't just a preference, it's a survival mechanism. It's deeply tied to their sense of identity and emotional safety. They've learned, often through early life experiences, that relying on others can lead to disappointment, rejection, or feeling trapped. So they build a strong internal rule: never depend on anyone. And because of that, the moment a relationship starts to demand interdependence, where two people support each other emotionally, consistently, and closely, they feel threatened, not necessarily by the other person, but by the possibility of losing the one thing that makes them feel safe, their autonomy. At the beginning of a relationship, avoidants often feel comfortable because there's enough space to maintain a sense of independence. There's excitement, novelty, and a low level of emotional demand. But as things progress and the emotional bond deepens, they start to feel like their freedom is being encroached upon. This isn't about control in the traditional sense. It's not that they're trying to dominate the relationship. It's that they feel safest when they're emotionally self-sufficient, when no one can impact them too deeply or create emotional expectations they don't feel prepared to meet. So when a partner naturally begins to expect more closeness, consistency, or shared life decisions, the avoidant starts to perceive this as a threat to their freedom. Even simple, healthy forms of connection, like wanting regular communication, making future plans, or expressing emotional needs, can feel like pressure. They might interpret it as clinginess or feel like they're being asked to give up who they are. This isn't because they don't love the other person. It's because emotional closeness begins to blur the lines between self and other, and that blurring feels dangerous to them. This is why many avoidant individuals have a pattern of leaving relationships just when things start to get serious. It's not always a conscious decision. They may genuinely believe that they just don't feel it anymore, or that they've outgrown the relationship. But in reality, what's happening is a deep emotional response to the loss of perceived independence. They associate closeness with obligation and obligation with emotional suffocation. So they create space by emotionally withdrawing, pushing the partner away, or leaving altogether. Sometimes their actions may seem contradictory. They might say they want a deep connection, but then act cold or unavailable. They might initiate intimacy, then disappear for days. This push-pull behavior is part of their struggle to balance the desire for connection with the need to remain emotionally autonomous. When they get too close, they feel like they're losing themselves. When they're too distant, they feel lonely. But rather than lean into the discomfort and work through it, they usually choose distance because that's the only coping strategy they trust. To the partner on the receiving end, this can be heartbreaking and confusing. You may feel like you're walking on eggshells, trying not to ask too much or trigger their need for space. Over time, you might suppress your own needs just to maintain peace, hoping that giving them more independence will make them feel safe enough to stay. But the hard truth is that for some avoidants, no amount of space will ever be enough, because what they're really running from it's the emotional vulnerability that closeness brings. They may rationalize their decisions by saying they need time to find themselves or focus on personal goals. They may frame the breakup as a move towards self-growth. And while those reasons might hold some truth, they often mask the deeper fear of being emotionally intertwined with someone else. In their mind, staying in the relationship means giving up control over their emotions, their time, or their future. And when that fear becomes too loud, love, even real, deep love, can take a backseat to the overwhelming drive to protect their independence. What's important to understand is that needing independence isn't inherently unhealthy. Everyone needs a sense of individuality in a relationship. But for avoidance, the need becomes rigid and defensive. It's not about creating a healthy balance of space and connection. It's about using space to avoid emotional discomfort. Until they recognize this pattern and begin to explore why they equate intimacy with loss of freedom, they will continue to sabotage close relationships. Because to them, losing their independence feels worse than losing someone they love. Avoidant individuals often struggle profoundly with the idea of emotional responsibility in relationships. To them, being responsible for someone else's feelings, even in a healthy, reciprocal way, can feel like being trapped. It's not that they lack empathy or don't care. In fact, many avoidants are deeply sensitive beneath their detached surface. But the weight of emotional accountability, having to consistently show up for another person, understand their emotional states, and respond in a supportive, regulated way can feel completely overwhelming. This discomfort usually stems from childhood or formative experiences where they were either emotionally neglected or expected to take on too much emotional responsibility too soon. In those early environments, they may have learned that emotions lead to chaos, rejection, or abandonment. As a result, they developed an internal rule. It's safer not to feel, and even safer not to get too close to anyone who does. So when a romantic partner begins to open up or naturally expects emotional support, the avoidant doesn't interpret it as a moment of connection. They see it as pressure, a potential trap that will demand more than they feel capable of giving. When someone you're in a relationship with is upset, vulnerable, or needs reassurance, a securely attached person will usually lean in, but the avoidant often leans out, not because they don't care, but because they don't trust themselves to navigate the situation correctly. They may fear saying the wrong thing, being emotionally held hostage, or having to sacrifice their own needs to meet yours. To them, emotional responsibility can feel like a demand to perform, to be on, and to fix something they don't understand. Instead of trying and risking failure or discomfort, they retreat. You might see this play out in subtle ways. When you express hurt, they might go silent. If you bring up a difficult topic, they might minimize it or change the subject. When you cry, they might freeze or leave the room. It's not necessarily cruelty, it's avoidance. These are defense mechanisms developed over years to protect themselves from the perceived danger of emotional entanglement. But to the partner, it can feel cold, invalidating, or even cruel. You might wonder why they can't just be there for you, why emotional intimacy seems to push them away instead of drawing them closer. Over time, this emotional unavailability builds up. The partner begins to feel unseen, unsupported, and emotionally alone, even while in the relationship. If they try to talk about this, the avoidant might interpret the conversation as criticism or pressure and respond with defensiveness or more distance. The more emotional responsibility they feel, the more likely they are to withdraw. Eventually, when the emotional needs of the relationship surpass what they're willing or able to engage with, they may decide to leave entirely. To the avoidant, walking away can feel like self-preservation. If they stay, they risk being overwhelmed by emotions they don't know how to handle. They may fear becoming the source of someone else's pain or feel paralyzed by the idea of never being enough emotionally. So rather than try and fail, they leave. It's easier to exit the relationship than to sit in the vulnerability of emotional responsibility. Even if they love you, that love doesn't automatically override their fear. The discard, when it happens, is often not about a lack of care. It's about a lack of capacity. What makes this especially confusing for their partner is that avoidants often return to the relationship after time has passed when the emotional pressure has subsided. They might reach out, express regret, or say they miss you. And in that space, it can feel like they've changed. But what's actually happened is that they feel safe again. Distance has restored their sense of control. What hasn't necessarily changed is their ability to hold emotional responsibility in an ongoing, close relationship. If they haven't done the inner work to address their fears, the cycle will repeat. Understanding this pattern is not about excusing avoidant behavior, but it does offer clarity. It helps you see that their detachment isn't personal. It's protective. Until they can learn to sit with discomfort, communicate through emotion instead of shutting it down, and build emotional resilience, they will continue to see love as something that costs too much emotionally. And in their world, the cost of responsibility often feels greater than the value of connection. So even when they love you, they may leave not because you asked for too much, but because they don't yet know how to give. One of the most deeply rooted reasons an avoidant partner might discard someone they love is their intense fear of being truly seen. On the surface, avoidants often appear composed, independent, and in control. They may even come off as confident or emotionally self-sufficient. But underneath that exterior lies a complex emotional landscape shaped by past wounds, unprocessed shame, and the belief that their true selves are not worthy of love. So when a partner gets too close, when intimacy starts peeling back the layers, they become terrified that what lies beneath won't be accepted. And rather than risk that exposure, they pull away. This fear isn't always conscious. Many avoidants don't walk around thinking, I'm afraid to be seen. Instead, they simply feel a rising sense of discomfort, unease, or even panic as the relationship becomes more emotionally intimate. They may feel off or restless and start projecting that discomfort onto the relationship itself. They convince themselves that something is wrong with you or with the dynamic, when in truth, it's the closeness that is activating their internal alarm system. That alarm is rooted in the belief that love is conditional, and that if someone really saw who they are, flaws, fears, emotional baggage, and all, they would leave. This internal fear often stems from childhood experiences where being authentic was unsafe. Maybe they had caregivers who were critical, emotionally unavailable, or only gave love when the child was good, quiet, or independent. Over time, they learned to hide parts of themselves, especially the vulnerable ones. They became experts at emotional self-containment, believing that was the only way to avoid rejection or disappointment. So when a partner in adulthood begins to see through the cracks in the facade, starts noticing the inconsistencies, the emotional blocks, or the moments of emotional rawness, it feels like a threat, because to them, love has always been something you have to earn or perform for, not something you can receive just by being fully and perfectly yourself. When someone sees them clearly, it forces them to confront parts of themselves they've spent years avoiding. You might begin to notice their patterns, call out their defensiveness, or gently point out when they're emotionally withdrawing. And while these are healthy behaviors in a relationship built on mutual growth, to an avoidant, it can feel like being exposed. They may begin to feel scrutinized, judged, or even controlled. Even if that's not your intention, your desire to understand and connect feels to them like a spotlight being turned on in a room they'd rather keep dark. This can create a paradox. On one hand, they crave connection like everyone else. They want to be loved, accepted, and safe. But the moment someone gets close enough to truly offer that, they panic, because love that truly sees you demands vulnerability. And vulnerability is the exact thing they've built their entire emotional survival system to avoid. So they start to retreat. They might criticize you, shut down emotionally, create distance, or end the relationship altogether. Not because you did something wrong, but because you crossed the invisible line between safe distance and emotional exposure. It's devastating to be on the receiving end of this pattern. You've offered understanding, patience, and love. You've tried to see them, really see them, because that's what love does. But for the avoidant, that level of visibility feels unsafe. They weren't taught that being fully seen is a path to deeper intimacy. They were taught that it leads to rejection. So even when the relationship is healthy, even when love is present, they might leave because leaving restores the illusion of control. It allows them to retreat back into emotional safety, even if it costs them the connection they secretly longed for. This is why avoidants often feel regret after discarding someone they loved. Once the threat of exposure is gone, once you're no longer close enough to truly see them, they feel safe enough to miss you. But unless they confront the deeper fear that being seen equals being rejected, the pattern continues. They'll keep discarding love, not because they don't want it, but because they don't believe they can survive it. And that's the painful irony. What they want most, real, lasting love, requires the one thing they're most afraid to give themselves. Not the version of themselves they've polished for the outside world, but the messy, scared, flawed human. Until they learn that being seen isn't dangerous, but essential to real intimacy, they will keep running from it. And they may walk away from someone who loved them because they were finally feeling seen for real. So here's the truth. Being in love with someone who has an avoidant attachment style can feel like loving a ghost. They're there, but not fully present, but just out of reach. And when they leave, it doesn't always make sense. You're left questioning yourself, retracing every step, trying to figure out what you did wrong, when in reality, the reasons they discarded you often had far more to do with them than with you.
Avoidants don't leave because you weren't enough. They leave because real connection pokes at old wounds they haven't healed. It threatens the emotional armor they've spent years building. When they start to feel seen, needed, or emotionally responsible, their instincts scream, run. Not because they don't love you, but because they don't know how to love in a way that also includes closeness, responsibility, and vulnerability.
Understanding this doesn't mean you should excuse hurtful behavior or stay in a cycle of being discarded and reel back in. It means you stop internalizing their fear as your failure. You begin to realize that you can want closeness, honesty, and emotional safety, and not be too much for asking. Real love requires being seen and being willing to see the other person too. If someone can't meet you there, that's not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of where they are on their own emotional journey. Let them go with compassion, but don't shrink to make yourself easier to love. Heal, grow, and when the right person comes along, the one who doesn't fear your depth but honors it, you'll understand why the ones who couldn't stay had to leave.